Imagine standing in the middle of a Chinese megacity at 2 o'clock in the morning. Neon lights reflect off endless glass skyscrapers. Luxury malls stay open past midnight. High-speed trains glide silently beneath glowing apartment towers that stretch all the way to the horizon. Everywhere you look, it feels like the future arrived early. This is the image China spent 30 years building, a civilization moving faster than human history had ever seen before. And for a long time, the numbers seem to prove it. Hundreds of millions escaped poverty. Entire cities appeared almost overnight. Villages transformed into forests of steel and concrete. China built more highways, airports, and apartment complexes than any nation on Earth. By the late 2000s and 10s, the country's real estate sector had become so massive that property and construction were estimated to account for nearly 30% of China's entire economy. But then the camera moves further out, the highways become emptier, the apartment towers darker. And suddenly, you notice something strange. Thousands of windows with no lights inside them. Entire districts with almost no people. Gigantic neighborhoods where the elevators still work, the fountains still run, the stores are still open, but nobody actually lives there. Welcome to China's ghost cities. Now, to understand how this happened, you have to understand one thing about modern China. In America, people buy stocks. In Europe, people store wealth in pensions. But in China, for millions of ordinary families, apartments became the financial system itself. Real estate was not just housing. It was savings. It was status. It was retirement. It was security. It was the Chinese dream. Parents emptied life savings to help their children buy homes. Young couples took on enormous mortgages before even getting married. Some families bought second or third apartments simply because they believed prices could only go one direction, upward. And for years, they were right. Local governments became addicted to selling land. Developers borrowed unimaginable amounts of money to build faster and bigger. Banks kept lending because rising prices made everything appear safe. Entire cities began depending on construction to keep jobs alive and GDP growing. Then the system reached insanity. Developers like Evergrande accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. Apartments were sold before construction even began. In some cities, there were enough empty homes to house millions of people. China wasn't just building houses anymore. It was building growth itself. And that worked beautifully. Right until people started asking the most dangerous question any bubble can face. What happens if prices stop rising? Because once an economy becomes dependent on infinite growth, even slowing down starts to look like collapse. Imagine you are 28 years old, living in Shanghai. You wake up at 6:30 in the morning inside a tiny apartment box, stacked somewhere on the 32nd floor of a concrete tower, identical to the other 50 towers surrounding it. You squeeze onto a crowded subway, packed with exhausted office workers staring silently into their phones. By 8 a.m., you're already sitting in front of a computer. And if you're lucky, you leave work before 10 p.m. This is what modern Chinese ambition looks like. For years, China operated on a simple, unspoken deal. Work harder than everyone else today. Sacrifice your youth, endure the pressure, and eventually, you will own an apartment, or raise a family, and enter the middle class. That promise built modern China. The problem is that millions of young Chinese people are starting to realize the deal no longer works. Let's look at the numbers. Youth unemployment in China became so severe in 2023 that the government temporarily stopped publishing the statistics altogether after the official urban youth unemployment rate climbed above 21%. And many analysts believe the real number was significantly higher. University graduates entered one of the most competitive job markets on Earth only to discover that salaries were stagnating while housing prices remained detached from reality. In major cities like Beijing, Shenzhen, and Shanghai, apartments routinely cost 30 to 40 times the average annual salary. Think about how insane that is. In many Western countries, housing bubbles become dangerous around 8 to 10 times income. In parts of China, people were looking at lifetime debt just to buy an unfinished concrete box. And yet millions still rush to buy. Because owning property in China became tied to social survival itself. Without an apartment, marriage becomes harder. Starting a family becomes harder. Status disappears. Parents pressure their children to buy homes, not because they are greedy, but because they genuinely fear their children will fall behind permanently. Then the developers started collapsing. Projects stopped mid-construction. Families continued paying mortgages on apartments that did not even exist yet. Across China, angry middle-class buyers organized mortgage boycotts, refusing payments on unfinished buildings, slowly rotting behind construction fences. And this is where the psychological shift begins. Because once people stop believing that hard work guarantees stability, the entire emotional engine of the economy starts breaking down. Young people began embracing something called tang ping, or lying flat, a quiet rebellion against endless competition. Instead of chasing careers, marriages, and apartments, many simply gave up. Work less, spend less, stop competing, stop believing. At the exact same moment, China's birth rate collapsed to historic lows. And honestly, from the perspective of many young Chinese couples, the math makes brutal sense. Why bring children into a future where housing feels impossible, work never ends, and economic security looks increasingly fictional? This is the real danger facing China. Not simply a housing slowdown, but a collapse of confidence. Because the Chinese middle class is beginning to realize something deeply uncomfortable. They were never just buying homes, they were buying the illusion of safety. And once that illusion starts cracking, the real estate crisis slowly transforms into something far more dangerous: a crisis of belief in the future itself. For almost 4 decades, China looked economically unstoppable. Factories expanded endlessly. Highways stretched across entire provinces. New skyscrapers appeared faster than most countries could repair old roads. Every year seemed to bring another impossible statistic, another record export number, another megacity, another prediction that China would eventually overtake the United States itself. And for a long time, that prediction genuinely looked plausible. But here is the uncomfortable reality starting to terrify economists behind closed doors. Modern China became dependent on growth rates that may no longer be possible. Because underneath the futuristic skylines and bullet trains sits an economy carrying one of the largest debt mountains in human history. Nowhere is this more dangerous than inside China's local governments. See, most people imagine Chinese cities funding themselves through taxes the way Western governments do. But for years, many local governments relied on something far more fragile: selling land to property developers. This became the hidden engine of the Chinese economy. Developers borrowed enormous amounts of money. They bought land from local governments. They built apartments. Families bought the apartments. Prices rose. Then the cycle repeated again. Construction didn't just create housing, it created GDP growth itself. At one point, some provinces became so dependent on property activity that land sales accounted for nearly half of local government revenue. Entire regional economies started functioning like giant real estate corporations disguised as governments. And then the bubble began slowing down. Developers collapsed. Apartment sales weakened. Construction froze. Suddenly, local governments found themselves trapped. The debts remained, but the money stopped flowing. Today, analysts estimate that hidden local government debt in China may total trillions of dollars, once off-the-books financing vehicles are included. Some smaller cities are already struggling to pay salaries, maintain infrastructure, or refinance old loans without central government support from Beijing. And this creates a terrifying political problem, because the Chinese Communist Party built its legitimacy on one central promise: you may not have Western-style democracy, but your life will continuously improve. As long as incomes rose, apartments appreciated, and opportunities expanded, most people accepted the system. Economic growth became the social contract itself. But what happens when that growth slows? This is what Beijing fears more than almost anything else. Not necessarily recession, not even debt. Social instability. A generation of unemployed graduates. Families losing life savings. Middle-class citizens watching property values fall. Factory workers facing layoffs as foreign companies slowly move supply chains toward Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Because once expectations of endless upward mobility disappear, frustration becomes much harder to control, and the timing could hardly be worse. China's population is now shrinking. Birth rates are collapsing. The workforce is aging. Foreign investment has started weakening, and geopolitical tensions with the United States continue intensifying. For decades, China looked like the future of globalization. Now the world is beginning to ask a very different question. What happens if the engine of global growth itself starts slowing down? Because China is no longer just another large economy. It is deeply connected to nearly everything on Earth. The phones in your pocket, the factories supplying global markets, the shipping networks moving world trade, the commodities feeding industrial civilization itself. If the Chinese economic model seriously breaks, the shockwaves would not stop in Beijing or Shanghai. They would spread everywhere. And maybe that is the strangest part of this entire story. China does not look like a collapsing country. The airports still function. The skyscrapers still shine. The high-speed trains still arrive exactly on time. From the outside, the machine still appears powerful. But history is full of civilizations that looked stable right before the momentum stopped. And the real fear haunting China today is not that the country suddenly collapses tomorrow. It is something potentially much more dangerous. What if the greatest economic miracle of the 21st century has already reached its limit? If you enjoyed this video on how China's housing bubble became a national trap, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you want more deep dive documentaries like this. And tell me, which country should we explore next?